I'm going to do that, and we'll just start at the beginning.
Yep.
Very interesting character. I've been reading a lot this morning, so.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm always so grateful that you do, and I'm so honored that you asked me to continue to keep doing this. Later this week on the 9th, we celebrate the heavenly birthday, that is to say, the day of the death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You may have heard of him. His name was very big in American Christian circles back when I was in university in the 60s, and maybe for quite some time after. He's still a fixture, but perhaps not as much of a household name as he once was. His name is kind of a mouthful, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was born in Breslau in 1906, and to just shoot to the end, he dies in Flossenburg concentration camp, executed because of his association with a plot to assassinate Hitler. He dies just a couple of weeks before the Americans liberate that camp on April the 9th of 1945. So in some ways, he has a profile not unlike Mother Maria Skobtsova, who we looked at the last time. Bonhoeffer was the son of a very prominent family. His father was a professor of psychiatry and neurology at the University of Berlin. He was a critic of Freud. His mother came from a very aristocratic Prussian family, the von Hasses. His sisters married notables, including two men who would eventually be executed also for their attempt to save the German people from a maniac, namely Hitler. He was a brilliant student. I mean, so brilliant that he had finished his doctoral degree at the age of 21 and was too young to be ordained a pastor in the Lutheran Church. So one of the things that they did to give him something to do in the meantime is that they sent him to Union Theological Seminary in New York City in 1930. So they asked him to go there because they had previously had very little connection, the German universities and the German church, with America. And so he went there and he worked with, among others, the very well-known American theologian and pastor Reinhold Niebuhr. And he also, when he was there, availed himself of the opportunity to go just a few blocks to the east and to go to the famous Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, where he heard Adam Clayton Powell Sr., that's the father of the then later famous congressman and pastor Adam Clayton Powell Jr., preach. And he learned about the gospel tradition, the spirituals of the African American church. He got a chance to see poverty and racism right in front of his eyes there in Harlem in the early 1930s. He also got a car and with a friend did a tour driving all the way from New York City down into Florida and then across through Texas and Arizona to Southern California and then back to New York City. Got a real sense of America. It was a very important experience for him because it got him out of his sort of enclosure first in the world and the academic circles of Germany, but even more so got him out of the, if you will, the confines of Western Europe. One of the things that he did throughout his life was to cultivate relationships, ecumenical ones, with people outside of his church and outside of his country. One of these was the very famous Anglican Church of England Bishop Arthur George Bell. And he also had very close relationships with the Danish Lutheran Church and with the Benedictines, the Catholic Benedictines, not only in Germany, but also in Austria. He had a very brilliant career. He was already publishing books even before he had a full-time professorship. We're going to be looking at a number of quotes in a few minutes from probably one of his best-known books, The Cost of Discipleship, which in fact in German has a very different title. In German, it's called Following After Christ, but somehow in English, they decided The Cost of Discipleship. Now, these are pictures of Bonhoeffer. You see him there on the left, two different pictures of him, one when he was younger up in the left-hand corner, one when he was older, where the cursor is right now. And then the very lovely young woman over here is his fiancée, whom he never really got to marry because he was imprisoned for his anti-Nazi activities, and he was executed then in 1945. Her name was Ruth Wiedemeyer. She was considerably younger than he, almost 20 years younger than he. He was about 35 or so when he was engaged to her. She was around 18 or 19, if I'm not mistaken. Bonhoeffer also had served in parishes outside of Germany. When he began to be discriminated against for his anti-Nazi preaching and writing, he was sent to take care of two German-speaking parishes in England. And here we have a picture of him and his confirmation class on some kind of a hike. This is a group of students of his who belonged to the parish that he took care of. He took care of two parishes in London, two German-speaking parishes in London. One was a Lutheran parish, the other was a Reformed parish. Now, that was very often done in those days because back in Germany, there were sort of relationships, full communion relationships between the Reformed Church and the Lutheran Church. Bonhoeffer wrote a very important book on ethics. He also wrote as his doctoral dissertation and eventually revised it and published it as a book, a study called Communio Sanctorum, the communion of saints, an argument not far removed from what I try to do in my book, an argument that at the very core of what church is a communion or community of those who are disciples of Christ, of those who are trying to follow Christ. Hence the title in German, as I said, of his most popular book, Following After, Die Nachfolge, the following after Christ, which of course in English is translated very differently as The Cost of Discipleship, but we'll get that to in a moment. As soon as it became clear that Bonhoeffer was in the opposition groups within the Lutheran churches in Germany, he began to lose his academic positions, when in fact there was a law passed in 1934 that the Arian principles should be applied also to the churches, which meant that anybody with any Jewish background would be tossed out of positions that they had as rectors of parishes and in fact taken off the roster of the clergy. That's how far this was going. When he started to speak out against this, he began to lose whatever positions that he had. And he therefore, with a good friend of his, started a kind of underground, or how shall I say, concealed seminary for a group that called themselves the Confessing Church. These were people who were standing in opposition, both public and as well as private, opposition to the Third Reich. He and another Lutheran theologian named Hermann Sasse drafted a kind of a statement of their principles, of why they were objecting to the kind of Christian nationalism, of extreme nationalism of Hitler, the emphasis on Aryan identity and belonging, and the discrimination against not only Jews, but also just about everybody else who was not Aryan. So this would include the Romani, the Gypsies, It would include African Americans. You may remember the famous 1936 Olympics and Wilfred Owen. You may also recall that when the Nazis moved into Eastern Europe, they started liquidating the Slavs. And the plan was, at least so it was told me when I visited Auschwitz maybe 15 or 20 years ago, that they built solid, sturdy brick dormitories there, and even bigger, more solid crematoriums and gas chambers, because they intended, after the Jews were all exterminated, to start exterminating all the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Russians and the rest. So as we stand in a time in which we see now that the Russian army is not just attacking Ukraine, but committing atrocities, rapes, torture, murder of civilians, people with their hands tied behind their heads and their heads, back of their heads shot into, we realize that war does not abide by the international rules of war or the Geneva Conventions, not now and not back during the Second World War. And by the way, the Allies were also guilty of this. The Allies, in many cases that have now been documented, mistreated prisoners, both German prisoners as well as Japanese prisoners. But we also know the unbelievable torture and mistreatment of Allied prisoners by the Japanese. The bridge over the River Kwai, for example, that famous film documents it, the Bataan Death March, and so forth, and the treatment of them in detention camps that were supposed to be not extermination camps, but in which, in fact, Americans and British and French and other prisoners were worked to death and starved to death. This I only bring up because Bonhoeffer ended up giving his life as a pastor, preaching and writing and speaking out against this killing machine that the Third Reich had become. And it's hard for me, who was born after the Second World War, and my father, who was a decorated veteran of that war, it's hard to process this now happening again in the 21st century. Yes, we had it a few years ago in Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, but we also saw it going on in Syria. But now we're seeing it in a country that I, of course, have roots in, because all of my grandparents came from Ukraine. I bring that in because here's a person who spoke out against it, not just as a pacifist, not just as an opponent to war, but as a priest, as someone who was ordained to preach the gospel and to stand up for what Christ said. And we'll see that in some of the quotes in just a minute. As I said, I'm going to end with this. He was not directly involved in the plot to try to assassinate Hitler by a bomb, but he did help exchange some messages. And therefore, since his name was mentioned in some of the diaries of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and since I believe his name was mentioned in a couple of other documents that somehow the Nazis, the Gestapo, got hold of, he and anybody else were brought into first military prisons and then a concentration camp. And I won't go into the details of it, but Hitler was so enraged with them that he decided that they would not be just shot or beheaded, but they would be tortured to death. And that's in fact what happened with them. And so, someone who would have been an enormously important part of the rebuilding of Germany as a country, but also of the church in Germany, was exterminated. He wasn't the only one. There were other important military figures, academics, other clergy as well, who died in the camps in Dachau. This is a picture from one of the ecumenical retreats. They're on the island of Fanø, off of Denmark. These were retreats that brought together clergy and laity from the Anglican churches, the Lutheran churches, the Reformed churches, in some cases also the Catholic and the Orthodox churches too. The younger clergy, the younger the younger laity, people who would eventually become leaders. And this was in the 1930s, and you can bet that they understood, they saw right in front of them the rise of fascism, both in Italy as well as in Germany. Yeah. And I think there's one or two more, Patrick. This is a statue in Westminster Abbey. You may know that on the west facade, they have the witnesses or the martyrs of today. So St. Archbishop Oscar Romero is there. I don't know if Mother Maria Scotsova is there, but this is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the few places you will see him in his vestments. In the Lutheran Church of his time, they wore the preaching gown, and you can see the preaching tabs on the top. And I believe for communion, they put a surplice over the top of that. You don't often see pictures of him in the vestments of his holy orders, but there he is. And he's holding the book of the scriptures. He's holding what he based his life on, what he preached from, what he stood up for, and what he died for. Okay, so now what I propose, the quotes. Yes, I have a few quotes. We don't have to go through all of them, but we could take a look at some of them. And if any of you are interested, I can send them around to you. But let's begin with the first one. The community of the saints is not an ideal community consisting of perfect and sinless men and women where there is no need of further repentance. No, it is a community which proves that it is worthy of the gospel of forgiveness by constantly and sincerely proclaiming God's forgiveness. Notice here, this is exactly the way that the scriptures say it. It isn't just we who say, I take Christ as my personal savior, therefore I'm saved, and therefore I am part of the perfect community of faith. No, we can only be part of the community of faith, Bonhoeffer is saying, if we not only are forgiven by God, but then proclaim God's forgiveness and put that forgiveness into action, put it into reality, put it into the world, make it happen in the world. Sanctification, now that's a big word. I always find that it's too big a word. It means the thing that we're all called to do by our baptism, to become saints, to become holy. Sanctification means driving out the world from the church, as well as separating the church from the world. But the purpose of such discipline is not to establish a community of the perfect, but a community consisting of men and women who really live under the forgiving mercy of God. You have to be very careful of what he means here. He is certainly not saying here in this quote from his book, nor did he do this in his life, that we have to separate ourselves and turn in upon ourselves and ignore the world. What he means here is the way that the world is used in the Gospel of John. The world is everything that is turning away from God, everything that denies God, everything that despises and ridicules God and love and mercy and forgiveness. We see this all around us. It's at the heart of racism. It's at the heart of homophobia and misogyny. It's at the heart of genocide. It's at the heart of capitalist domination at the cost of people's lives. That's the world. Now, we can't do away with that world. That world is stronger than we are. But we have to be able to be a witness or give a witness to that world. So I think, the words here could easily be misread and misinterpreted. There's nothing in any of Bonhoeffer's writings, and surely in his life and in his death, there's nothing to warrant the idea that we should separate ourselves and create a kind of a little community of exclusion. By the way, I will point out that Bonhoeffer himself says that his experience living in Harlem, touring through the United States, really had an impact on his idea of how the church, in fact, had to be there as a witness in the world, because he saw, for example, in the churches in America, he saw that they did this. He saw that the Black church certainly did it with enormous power and enormous confidence. But he also saw racism. But he studied with people like Niebuhr. He heard from the preaching in the Black churches the very clear message that God is at work all the time to make the Exodus possible, to make people capable of leaving the slavery of capitalism, of evil, of sin, to move forward into the joy of the promised land, the joy of the kingdom. Let me just take one other, and then I'm going to shut up so that people could maybe say something, ask questions, go on to some other quotes. I'll just take the next one that's there. The one that will, okay. If any man, and I'm going to say if anyone would come after me, let him deny him or herself. The disciple must say to him or herself the same words Peter said of Christ when he denied him. I know not this man. Self-denial is never just a series of isolated acts of mortification or asceticism. Mortification means to put to death the things that you want, the things that you desire. It is not suicide, for there is an element of self-will even in that. To deny oneself is to be aware only of Christ and no more of self, to see only him who goes before and no more the road which is too hard for us. Once more, all that self-denial can say is, he, Christ, leads the way, keep close to him. And again, it could be easy to look at this and say, this is all very abstract. This is all very theoretical. Talk of mortification or asceticism. I mean, how can we sort of dilly-dally in that when the world is going, to hell in a moment where genocide and torture and murder are going on? What he's talking about here is something that's at the heart of every one of us, and that is that Christ asks us to do things that are extremely difficult. Christ asks us to look at things and decide and discern in a way that is extremely demanding, because it goes against our culture, it goes against our human nature. And I think this is really a sign of real pastoral discernment on Bonhoeffer's part. He's not just a professor of theology speaking here. He's somebody who's served in parish life. He's somebody who's been around people struggling to make an existence. And certainly he is someone who has lived in a time in which you had to either decide to stand up for Christ and the gospel, or to simply go along, as many did, with the Nazis, the so-called German Christians, saying, well, of course, yes, the church should back the state. The church should save the race. The church should be on the side of those in power, something we see tragically going on in the Russian Orthodox Church today. So I'm going to stop and leave you all some chance to ask questions, make some comments. We can come back to some of these other quotes here too, okay? Hi, Ann. Didn't see you come in. Welcome.
All right, I'm going to start with I'd never heard of Bonhoeffer before Sunday when you sent me the images. And then I did some reading this morning, very interesting character. But I'm going to start with a question about a quote from one of his letters to Reinhold Niebuhr.
Mm-hmm.
He says, Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that he came back to New York City He had been there early in 1930 to 1931, and then he came back in 1938 and 1939. And Reinhold Niebuhr offered to get him, the government papers he would need to stay. He offered him a position to teach. He offered him, parishes that would take him on as an adjunct pastor. He could have saved his life. He could have done an enormous amount of good by staying in New York, but he told Niebuhr, after the war, I cannot take a place or a role in the rebuilding of Germany and of the church there if I ran away from it and saved myself. And
the quote that I read was actually from that same letter, and
right.
And the portion that I read was like the immediately following sentence. It's almost like you're quoting the letter,
right.
But
yes,
yeah.
So basically, what he's saying is that what do I do here? If I am an obedient German, then I root for the Nazis, who are destroying not only our country, but civilization and thousands of lives of people they deem unworthy of life. But if I go the other way, and if I become an opponent, then people could call me a traitor. And by the way, I have to tell you that for at least 15 to 20 years after his death, debate went on in Germany, especially in the church, about whether to call him a martyr or to just call him nothing, because he went against the German state, even though it was the Nazis. That's how ingrained loyalty is in German culture and in German consciousness. And by the way, if you think that there's something repulsive about that, ours is even worse. Ours is even worse, because it sometimes means, looking away from racism, looking away from despising of women and other minorities, to be a full, true American. I mean, look at what we've just seen in the last couple of years. Now it's considered to be okay to vandalize and to even attack and brutalize people of color because they're not really Americans, and to say to them, go back to where you came from. So what Bonhoeffer's talking about, oh my God, 80 or more years ago, is not some kind of historical oddity. We have our own version of it right here, right now.
Well, it seems that you mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church and the prelate. Is it Kirill?
Kirill, yeah. He's the patriarch.
Kirill,
yeah.
The patriarch.
He's the head archbishop, yeah.
The head archbishop seems to be playing the same role that the bishop who denounced Bonhoeffer for not supporting nationalism.
Right.
And he lost his position as a university professor because he was denounced as a, quote, pacifist and non-nationalist.
Right.
And it seems odd that you're kicking a priest out of his positions for being in favor of peace.
Right.
The parallels to Kirill and Putin are, as you say, very current.
Well, it's very, very clear that Kirill has been given a mandate, because every Sunday of Lent, his homily, I mean, you would think, having done it once, he'd shut up. But, and I'm embarrassed of this, obviously, because of, my connections to the Orthodox Church. But that's not my church, by the way, first and foremost. I never was part of that church. But every Sunday, it's as if he's got to not just mention it, but mention it again with a vengeance, that what's going on, the Russian troops in Ukraine, is almost God's will. It's almost a holy cause. They are stamping out the evils of the Western world. They're stamping out, all the things that the culture warriors even here despise. It was Kirill who brought up the fact that, one of the things that the Russian troops were saving Ukraine from was from gay pride parades. and probably lots of other things, probably women's equality, and on it goes. Uh, and I mean, this is not something that's taking place far, far away that we can all say to ourselves, "Oh, that's terrible. That goes on over there. We don't have that here." It is right here, right, right in our right where we are. I mean,
Where
there
is
are
this guy? Where is he?
Kirill. He's the
Russian
patriarch of
Orthodox.
Moscow. He's the Orthodox. He's the head archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church. He's the patriarch of Moscow. His name and his picture have been all over the news for the last 3 or 4 weeks, because he can't stop being a booster for what Putin and the Russian troops are doing in Ukraine.
Is he
Uh,
speaking out from a pulpit in the United States or in Russia?
No, in
No.
Russia. He's not in the United
Russia.
Okay.
States. No, I mean he's over there. So every Sunday he's in a different cathedral, but he's mouthing off that this is God's will. These people need to be cleansed and purged and chastened and punished, because they're striving to be like the rest in the West. I mean, he came out the first time and said the West is evil. Their ideas of freedom for everybody and tolerance for everybody are corruption, not virtue. What you're hearing is the same thing that in our country you hear mostly from evangelicals, right? Who back Trump and who say that if you want to be a true American, you have to be for what we stand for. So you have to be against a whole bunch of things because they're not godly. Margaret, I see you're making a.
Yeah, I'm curious about his bringing himself to the point where he could think of killing someone, even though that is not the Christian thing to do. With the assassination of Hitler, and I keep thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody would do that to Putin? But here was an intelligent man who was obviously also a deep Christian, and who allowed himself to come to that kind of a conclusion.
Well, if you went through the rest of the quotes on the page, we don't have time to do that. I chose them because they all have to do with our enemy. And in fact, Bonhoeffer himself was torn. He realized that you should not kill anybody, but he also came to the conclusion that his at least relaying messages, even though he himself did not personally take part in the assassination attempt, was a way of at least trying to end what was a nightmare. And eventually what happens? So many of the people hiding in the bunker, Hitler and his mistress and all, they all commit suicide, or in some cases are killed. There were numerous of his right hand people who killed their wives and killed their children, and then had somebody else kill them, Goebbels and others like that. And then the few that survived were put on trial, right? And in fact, we got to see their faces, and their defenses were they were following orders. Committing atrocities was not committing atrocities, it was following orders. And the orders were that these people are unworthy of life. The Jews, the Gypsies, the Mormons, the gay and lesbian people, anybody who was decided, Ukraine, anybody who was decided to be unwertig, unworthy of life, to exterminate them was not to commit an atrocity or a murder. It was simply to follow official policy. Where have we heard that before? You remember My Lai in the Vietnam War? I mean, on and on and on it goes. I mean, so in that sense, the debate about whether Bonhoeffer should be honored at all in Germany, we shouldn't just put that down and say what idiots. This is always a problem when it comes to society and the state, and even then the church or a believer over against that. There are people who believe that you should follow the state no matter what, my country, right or wrong. And Bonhoeffer could, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in direct answer to Margaret's question, I'm not sure Bonhoeffer was that directly connected to the actual assassination plot that he
But
would
he
have had to
knew it
say.
was going to happen.
But he knew, no,
Part of the
but
thing.
Margaret is right.
There were differing opinions among the plotters about whether to arrest and put Hitler on trial or assassinate him. And
Right.
some of them knew, some of them didn't. Bonhoeffer probably knew. But in direct answer to your question, Klaus von Stauffenberg supposedly said that it was against his religion to kill somebody, but weighing that against the greater evil, he thought that in that instance it was probably the correct thing to do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there were some who thought that perhaps they could get enough military leaders to try to pull a coup and arrest him and somehow convince all the bodyguards not to kill them, but to proceed against, because this guy was destroying their country. I mean, by the time you get to the attempt on Hitler's life, he's losing the war. I mean, there's no possibility. And in fact, had he decided to keep going, there would have been even a worse bloodbath than there was.
Right. And it wasn't the first attempt on Hitler's life either.
That's right.
But it's also interesting that Bonhoeffer sort of worked as a double agent, and his cover was that he was actually working for the German military intelligence, which is how he managed to pass his messages along under cover of going on trips for German military intelligence.
Right. His ecumenical work was considered to be part of German intelligence. But of course, what he did is he used those trips to various ecumenical conferences to, for example, his relationship and his correspondence with Bishop Bell and with others. He used the cover of the Abwehr, the German intelligence. But the trouble is that they didn't destroy their messages, and that's what got them all executed. They should have destroyed. I mean, good spies know that you don't leave any incriminating evidence. You destroy, you cover your tracks by destroying all of your messages. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the messages were discovered, and they were therefore able to track down almost everybody involved in this. But you're right. The first idea was to try to have a coup, but that they couldn't get enough. They couldn't get enough people to do that, and then they decided, well, to simply eliminate him was the best way, because he was the one who kept things together. With him gone, probably you could convince the others, to decide that this was futile. But I mean, if allowed to go on, they would have allowed thousands more German troops to be killed, and who knows how many civilians. They would have gone down in flames, sort of like a Wagnerian opera, right?
I want to ask you about the Deutsche Christians and two particular aspects. First of all, I had never heard of them.
The German Christians, yeah,
and two things in particular. One, apparently there was a struggle between whether the bishop or Hitler would be the head of the church, which is reminiscent of Tudor times and going forward. Right. And second, there was apparently a proposal which Bonhoeffer was instrumental in fighting to remove the Old Testament from the Bible because of Jewish roots.
Because of the Jewish roots, they wanted to exterminate any idea that Jesus was a Jew or that Judaism had any connection to Christianity. which interestingly enough, somebody back in the 2nd century named Marcion tried also to do. He tried to argue that the Jewish scriptures were not scriptures at all and should not be used by the Christian community. And that was solidly condemned by everybody as probably the worst heresy you could imagine, because it denied the very origins of Jesus and denied Jesus's connection to the scriptures. But the German Christians were those who felt that they could make a compromise and say that, as in the past, church and state, if not going hand in hand, at least should not be sort of put at conflict with one another. That the church should be serving the people, the church should be serving the society, and therefore the state. It's the old principle of Constantine, who simply declared, not only is Christianity now legal, it had been illegal before, but it is now the religion of the realm, and there will be toleration of no other religious traditions other than Christianity. I mean, we sometimes forget that when Constantine just made that decision, he made every other religious movement illegal and at least a potential enemy of the state. So the German Christians, I would say, were not all that different from Christians of other, countries and other time periods, who simply said, whatever American policy is, we will agree with it, we will go along with it. So, for example, Thomas Merton was condemned by a number of American bishops because he and Philip and Dan Berrigan and so many others took a stand against the Vietnam War. And the American Catholic bishops and the American Episcopal bishops in the early days of the Vietnam War were simply doing what they had been doing during the Korean War and the Second World War and the First World War before that. They were on the side of what they believed to be right. They backed the American policy of going to war. They blessed the troops. They provided little prayer books and Bibles for the soldiers and the sailors. They put their clergy in as chaplains. They were fully for the war effort. And I think during the Second World War, no one questioned that. It's only when we got closer to our own time, to very questionable wars, that people began to ask the question, is this unqualified support really valid? Margaret.
I just wanted to share with you all, back in the old days when that was all going on, I was part of the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, and we a bunch of us from Wisconsin drove to Washington, D.C. when they ordained the first bishop of the armed forces,
Right.
at the cathedral. And I have pictures of, I was a nun then still, and I have pictures of me holding the EPF cross at the protest.
At the
So
protest.
it was kind of fun to
Yeah. Yeah.
to let people know that we didn't all think that was a good idea.
Well, I can tell you at the same time,
I would love to see that picture.
at the same time you were doing that, I was still a Carmelite student friar in DC, in DC,
Oh, yeah.
Washington, DC. And we didn't wear our habits out to protest, but I know that the prior, the superior of our house, said that any of us who got caught and were put in custody would be immediately thrown out of the order. He was an absolute pro-war individual, as well as the provincial of the whole province. These priests and friars were all solidly behind the American war effort, just as they had been in Korea, just as they had been in World War II. And I mean,
Yeah.
that's why later on, when I left, not that long after, I became a conscientious objector, because I realized there was no way to not take a stand. I couldn't, just like some people I knew, look up at the list of the birth dates of those being drafted and say, oh, I'm down like in the last 25, nothing for me to worry about, right? I mean, I had friends, who were down there in the last 25. I, however, with April 3rd, was up there in the top 20. So, that made it quite real for me.
The title of that war and all other wars was called A Just War.
A just war. A just war. Yeah, I don't know. I did a presentation on Merton, and one of the things in 1964 is he invited the Berrigan brothers, A.J. Musty, a whole bunch of other people in the peace movement, an ecumenical group. There were Mennonites, Catholics, Presbyterians, I can't remember who else. He invited them down to the monastery in Kentucky to have a retreat. And the very first, since he was the host, he led off with a presentation saying, by what warrant, what is our justification for opposing war? That's the very first thing. Now, you say, come on, Father Tom, why would you even ask that kind of a question? He realized that the entire American church at that point, Protestant, Catholic, and otherwise, was solidly behind the war effort. And he realized it would take a lot of work to dislodge that, to get people thinking about, should we be supporting this war? And just as Bonhoeffer did, he realized that the only way that he could have any leverage with his own church in Germany was by becoming part of the confessing church movement. And those people eventually had to go underground because they were seen quite correctly by the Third Reich as enemies of the state. They were enemies of the state.
I thought that,
Let's be honest.
Policy.
Go ahead, Carrie.
I thought that the reason that Martin Luther King was assassinated was because he came out not only against all the racism that was going on, but against the war.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that really,
That made a big difference, yeah.
Yes,
that
that made a big difference. Yeah.
very
Yeah.
soon after that, he was assassinated.
Yeah, I mean, he came out in a sermon that he gave at the Riverside Church, not far away from which I lived for about 5 years on the Upper West Side. He was invited there to preach on a Sunday morning. He also gave almost the exact same sermon at the National Cathedral in Washington. And in both cases, the reaction in the press was negative. I mean, it was one thing for him to be a civil rights activist when he also revealed himself to be an anti-war activist.
And connected the two.
And connected the two.
Yeah.
And being Black, it made no difference that he was an ordained pastor. He now had an even bigger target on his head. I mean, he had always had a target on his head. There had already been one attempt to firebomb his house and kill him and his family. There had been another attempt to stab him, but that was that really put him in harm's way. I think most of us are old enough to remember King when he was alive and remember the times. And the thing I tell people who are younger is he was not revered, loved, celebrated, and liked. He was hated by many, many people. He was considered to be the most uppity Black person in America. And this was not something that people tolerated very well at all.
Maybe a
Yeah,
little
my father thought he was just horrible.
Yeah.
Well,
That was
my father railed against Eisenhower and that silly man pushing a silly little ball around the golf course. But it was Eisenhower that said, beware of the military industrial complex.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what King was connecting to, connecting the dots to the big, the big money guys.
Right.
But
So
you
that's
carry
why I
Two
think,
things.
today's, and the school children are learning to memorize King's speech from the Lincoln Memorial.
right.
So justice
Right.
succeeds.
Yes, but at the
Yeah,
same time, as I said to Carrie the other day, the sacred ground. You remember the sacred ground course that we did, right,
Yeah.
during the pandemic? Anne was in that. I think I don't know, Patrick was in that, but the
No.
rest of us here today, you remember the sacred ground where we looked at not only the Native Americans, but the Latinos and the African American experience and others, and how, in a sense, the church had failed. There was a history of failure on the part, not of just the Episcopal Church, but of all churches, to really stand on the right side of things. Well, that curriculum, which was produced by the national church, the National Episcopal Church, if you put that in front of the governor of Florida today, or Ted Cruz, that would be immediately dismissed as critical racial theory.
Yep.
I mean, it's that
Don't say
close.
gay.
You and I and several of us here have read the pieces, watched the videos, discussed it, right? This was every Friday, wasn't it? Every Friday
Yeah,
morning. we did
absolutely.
this, right?
For a year plus.
It went on for months. And I told the bishop when she said, "Oh, we're gonna have to have you do an anti-racism course." I said, "Excuse me." A whole bunch
I
of
just
us at
did one.
St. Barnabas did the Sacred Ground course. Oh, she said, "You did?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I think we may have been one of the few parishes in the San Diego diocese to actually do it, So we did
Now
it.
that
And shaking her head, she remembers it. Yeah.
Anyway, I think one of the scariest parts to me about the evangelical church movement in the United States is that it is in large part turning church into nationalism, which sounds suspiciously familiar to what was going on with the Deutsche Christen.
Mhm.
And as another point to the discussions about the churches supporting the war efforts, I mean, it probably goes back to Constantine, but at least it certainly goes back 1,000 years to the Crusades. I mean, there the church wasn't just supporting war efforts, but the church was calling for war.
Of course. Of course. Because there was money in it, not necessarily directly for the church, but all of the lords, all of the kings, all of the counts would then be able, in the Holy Land, to cash in on an enormously promising pilgrimage site. I mean, part of it was to rid then Palestine of all the Muslims that were there and make it essentially a colony of Europe, and then be able to say to pilgrims from all over the then known world, "Come on in and stay at our hostels. Come on in and eat in our, dining halls. Buy trips by boat. The fastest way to get there is to sail across the Mediterranean. Forget about all the overland traveling and stuff like that." There was an enormous amount of, secondary financial interest in that.
And we'll sell you fake olive wood crosses by the dozen.
Yes. All those trinkets and souvenirs that are sold at every pilgrimage place. So, but if you think about that, and then you think about later on the much more blatant examples of, God is with us, right? Back in the First World War, on the belt buckles of the Germans, as well as on the belt buckles of the English, where God is with us. God is on our side. Really?
I I apologize, but we're coming up on 1 o'clock and I actually have another meeting I need to go to.
Okay.
So
So I'm going to
gonna have to-
conclude, by reading a quote and just a quick prayer and thanking you all. Bonhoeffer wrote, "The messengers of Jesus will be hated to the end of time, and they will be blamed for all the division which rends cities and homes. Jesus and his disciples will be condemned on all sides for undermining family life, for leading the nation astray. They will be called crazy fanatics, disturbers of the peace, traitors. The disciples will be sorely tempted to desert their Lord. But we must remember that the end is always near. They must hold on, those who follow Jesus, and persevere until it comes. Only they will be blessed who remain loyal to Christ and his word till the end. We thank you, Lord, for your witness, your servant, the pastor and teacher, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Help us in our own ways now in the 21st century to learn from his witness and follow his example. This we ask through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.